This is the first installment in a sequence of videos on creating decorators. So before we get into creating decorators, we're going to have to go back and review some material from the previous course to make sure that you remember everything that was in that video or in those lessons. So we're looking at global versus local variables, or as some Pythonicists talk about it, looking at the namespace. So I've declared here a global variable a equals 100. I've defined a function which just sets b equal to 2 and then prints a couple of things. I'm going to talk about those in a second. In the main program, we print off a couple of things. We call this function that we've declared and we print off some things again. As you can see up here, I've stolen part of this idea from this website, Simeon Franklin. I got this idea for globals and locals function. These are built-in functions. I didn't know these existed until I read his website, so a little credit to him. Alright, so globals and locals, these are built-in functions that will print off all of the variables that are considered to be globals and locals in the current position that you're in. So let's walk through this, and I'm going to run namespace 1 first, and we're going to print off 6 things. So the global variables here, first of all, there's some built-in global variables, some of which we don't need to know about, like loader. File is the file that we're currently running, so namespace 1, and you can see where that's located. Cached, we don't really need to know about at this point. The name of the program that's being run is main. This is the main program. And what else do we have here? Packages. This is the doc string right here. And we have a global variable a, which has a value of 100. So this is the variable I declared up here. And I hope I somehow managed to miss one. And we also have this function which I've declared. That is also a global variable. So it treats this function actually as a variable. Okay, and then all the variables that are declared. In the main part of the program, the globals and locals are the same. So 1 and 2 are going to print out the same thing. Okay. Now, the idea here is that when you go into function, then function is its own piece of code, and you can declare variables in here, but these variables like b are only accessible inside this function. So b is considered to be local to this function. Or if you want to talk about in terms of namespace, namespace is the set of words or characters that you can use when you're programming. So for example, you can use the function print. That is part of the namespace, the word print. And inside a function, we can use b. So that is part of the namespace. But I can't use b out here. B is unknown in the main part of the program. It's only defined inside the program. So it's local to func, and outside in the global part, it's undeclared. And so you can get an unresolved reference that's saying I don't know what b is. You can't use that. So in terms of the namespace inside of func, I can now use b, where I couldn't use it out here. I can use any of the built-in commands from Python, such as print, globals. Func, as it turns out, is going to be not local. Alright, so when I print the globals and locals inside of func, I'm printing a 3 and a 4 and ahead of them. So this line right here, the globals isn't going to change. I really didn't need to print this again, but you can see that if you compare the first 2 lines with this third line, then it's exactly the same. So the globals won't change. I didn't need to print this every time, but I did. The locals, on the other hand, inside of func, now are listing b as 2. And it doesn't matter that we've called func here. Afterwards, when we look at globals and locals again, you will see that the globals and locals, after having called func, are exactly the same as they were before we called func. So when you call func, this function is created. I'm driving Python nuts with my lack of 2 blank lines. When you call func, It then goes off and this piece of code is executed, and during the execution of this code, then b is created and then becomes a local variable to func. But once function is done executing, so we say set b equal to 2, we do these two prints, and then we end, and we come back here and we go down to this next print. So after func is executed, this b disappears, no longer exists. So globals and locals will be right exactly the same thing as they were before. All right, so again, in terms of the namespace, out here in the main program, by declaring a equals 100, a is part of the namespace in the main program by declaring this def func. Func is part of the namespace of the main program, and inside of func, when we add b equals 2, that becomes part of the namespace of this procedure. It's local to this procedure. And we also have, what I missed up here, is we have access to a. So when I printed 3, I guess I sort of said this, I implied it, but I didn't say it directly. Where is it? At the end. So this is line 3, this is what's being printed here. We have this global variable a. Alright, now let's look at namespace 2. I'll just go ahead and run that now, which is not much different from namespace 1, except for I've added in here an a equals 1. This is an important idea in terms of globals versus locals. Now, when I print 1 and 2 globals and locals, that's actually going to be exactly the same as it was in namespace 1. That hasn't changed at all. When we print globals and locals inside of func, something interesting is going to happen. So look, in globals, right, that's from 3, printing the character 3, and then globals, a is defined as a global and it's a 100. But then, if I look at locals, it says a is 1 and b is 2. How is that possible? How do I have two different definitions for a? In one case a is 100, and in the other case a is 1. In fact, I could print a here if I wanted to, and if I do, I'm going to get the value 1. There it is. So how is that possible? Well, it has to do with this namespace, and it has to do with the idea of globals versus locals. So when you ask for this print a down here, the way Python looks at this is it says, okay, you want the value for a. First, I look at global variables, or I look at what's in the local namespace for func, and it comes up here and finds a value of 1. Back here in this namespace 1, if I printed a and run this, it's going to print 100. Because here, and there it is, there's the 100, here it looks for a in the local namespace and doesn't find it, and so then it goes out and looks for a in a broader namespace and finds it as 100. So there's a hierarchy. In this case, it finds a in the local namespace, and that's the value that it uses. Oh, I gotta run this again. So you have to be aware of these differences between locals and globals. Sometimes people get confused on this and aren't paying strict attention to what they're doing and get confuse the ideas, and then that creates bugs in programs. Not a good idea. And I promise you this will all tie into decorators sooner or later. Alright, so in this case, this is a local A, this is a local B, and then when we come back out again, the locals and globals are the same as they were before. Function and A. And along with some other built-in Python variables that we don't need to know. Okay, continuing looking at namespace. Again, these are topics we've actually looked at before, so this really isn't anything new. Functions can have parameters. I can call that parameter anything I want, so I will call it x. And I'm going to pass to x the a. Now, this a is the global a, so I'm going to give it the value of 100. So x should have a value of 100. And then the question is x global or local? And we see by printing out the locals inside of func that parameter is actually local. I can't use x out here. I can't say print x. Even though I've now called the function a, if I say print x Python doesn't know what you're talking about, because again, this function is called x is assigned the value of 100. It is there. But then after all this code inside the function is done executing, all this information disappears and you come back to execution here. Alright. Now, I hadn't originally intended on saying this, but all this information, when you run this procedure, disappears. You can return information back from a function. Remember, we do that using a return. That is how we can get local information back to the main program. So I could return a value, and then that value gets set back to D, and then D is back in the global in the main part of the program. So one of the ways of thinking about returns is the ability to take something that's local and send it back to the main program. It's a different kind of twist on what return does. But A and X are local. Okay, now we can nest functions, so let's look at namespace and nesting functions and see how that works. I'll go ahead and run this. Now I have a few more prints of locals and globals, and the difference between this and what I've done before is that inside of this function I've defined another function. And I call these functions because that's what most people call them, but technically from the terminology I used in the first semester they're procedures because they don't return a value. Minor difference, nothing to worry about. But I can define this function inside of another function, and let's look at the namespace here. So globals, locals here. Let's see if anything has changed. So there's func. But there's no, there's A. So A and func are the two global variables that I have declared. Func2 is not one of the global variables. Now we call func with the value A. X will be local. Func2, let's see, we want N3. So let's see, this is, I'm sorry, we want 3 and 4. So I'm going to look at 3 and 4 and see what they have printed off. Func2 is local to func, right? We're inside of func. We're printing off globals and locals, and func2 is local to func. Now I call func2 and print globals and locals again, then 4 and N5. Or on 4 and 5. Oh, I got a repeat on the 4 and 5, don't I? Well, this is the second 4. And we see that the locals for func2 are Y, the parameter, and C. And I could, again, define an A in here and make it 0, and then that A would be local to func2, and if I try to use A inside of func2, the value would be 0. If I come back out here, the value for A is 1, because this A is in this namespace, and if I come out to the main program, the value of A is 100. The only way that I can affect a change on A is if I do this. By putting that global declaration in front of the A, and if I do that, then I have to define A in a separate line. We'll see what happens. Let me run this again. Notice that when I do this, I say A equals 0 here, but this is not one of the local parameters. The local variables. The local variables are still C and Y. But what has happened is that if you look at the variable A, it now has the value 0. So I have changed this value out here, and that's what the global declaration does. So hopefully that clears up some things with globals, and also ties together some things that we have learned before, in terms of global and local variables, or you can think of them as being the namespace. When Python is looking at a variable declaration or looking for a variable, so if I said print A, print C, it first looks locally, it finds the C there, prints it, and uses that value. If it didn't find C here, then it would go out to func and look for a C. Actually, if I did print B, it wouldn't find a B in here, but it would find B here and use this B as 2. And if it couldn't find B here, then it would go out here and find and look for B. In this case, it wouldn't find it. This global declaration overrides all of the way that Python searches, and when you put a global A here, it immediately goes out here and uses that global.